start the first thing in the morning with a counterplan discussion because you don't have any affirmative discussion yet, but I'll assume that all of you have kind of thought about what the affirmative does and is more in the negative mindset as we go into this discussion. So I'm going to be talking about counterplans. I am sure that there are various levels of understanding of counterplan in this room. So I'm going to start out each discussion kind of basic and then I'll move into the more advanced stuff. We'll move through stuff quickly if it seems like everybody's on the same page, and I'll slow down for anybody who needs more explanation on anything. So just let me know where you're at as far as understanding what's going on. So the counterplan is an important argument because when things are bad, which if the affirmative has done their job, they've probably found something out there that isn't so great in society and what's going on in the world. It's not always great to have to say, hey, we should just let those bad things remain. So the counterplan gives you an option to say that we can do something else. We think you need to do something, but we don't like what you're doing in particular. So that's really what the goal of the counterplan is. So the learning objectives for today are to talk specifically about the components of a counterplan so that everybody knows what they should have when they're running a counterplan. Theory arguments you might hear when running a counterplan, and hopefully kind of how to deal with those. How to debate those theory arguments, both on the affirmative and the negative, although that's going to be the area where we might run into crunch time. So bear with me on that. And then how to answer counterplans when you're on the affirmative, some stock answers that you can make on any counterplans that you hear in debate. So starting out, y'all ready for the counterplan? Sorry, I found some cool debate nerd memes to lead my lecture. So, all right, so components of a counterplan. Everybody in your notes, write down what the components of a counterplan are. What do you have to have in order to run a counterplan, in order to make a counterplan argument in a round? What's the absolute basics that you have to have? Write those down. And Zach, you're going to probably want to move because I'm going to have you pair up with people and you're kind of like the farthest away. All right. There's a seat over here next to Ryan. Right in the front. Okay, so now you got those written down. I want you to pair up with somebody, share and compare your answers. See if you all agree on what the components of the counterplan are. Just pair up.
What did you have, Michael?
You don't have to get a large group.
Besides being mutually
I mean, all I have is plan text and better than this is over.
I'm going to give you 10 more seconds to come up with a solid answer between you of what is required of counterplan.
Some people used to know the advantage.
There's no way to know. Dinosaur. I don't know if that'll be an essential component.
But that's not.
All right, so what do we have? What are some of the answers that we have?
Plan text.
All right, we need a plan text.
Or counterplan text.
Right, but it is a plan text. Yeah.
Needs to be mutually exclusive.
Okay, what's your name?
Manveer.
Okay, Manveer, what is that a broader concept of? So that is an argument that you need to have in your counterplan, but we don't necessarily make only mutual exclusivity arguments.
Okay.
We also make this other kind of competition argument. So what do you call that in your counterplan? Competition, yeah, exactly. So you can call it competition. Some people may call it, well, yeah, we'll just call it competition. That's good. All right, what else?
Solvency.
Okay, solvency, I'm going to put in parentheses down here. There's something else that belongs up here on top. Then more for LD maybe than Parley. It depends on your judge.
Reasons to prefer.
No, not necessarily. You don't need those. These are necessary components for a counterplan.
Non-topicality.
Yes, you need some kind of topicality or resolutionality discussion. That is particularly important right now in LD, but probably depending on your judge also in Parley, I would imagine. So we'll talk about all these things. I put solvency in parentheses because it really depends on how much of the affirmative solvency you can capture through your counterplan text. sometimes your counter plan, you can point back to things in their cards that you actually can garner solvency. So you wouldn't necessarily have to have that in the 1NC, but you definitely should have the rest of these things in the 1NC. Okay? So good job, you guys got those parts. So let's look at the text more specifically. Important thing about text, and for some of you in the parliamentary side of things, you may think, we don't need to write this down. I disagree. I think you need to have it written down somewhere. And the reason for that is because a lot of people are shady, okay? And they will change their counterplan on you if you don't force them to really read it clearly and delineate the things that it does and does not do. It is particularly important in LD that you have it written down so that if there's any permutation discussion, it's very easy to compare those two texts at the end of the round, okay? So I think you should always have it written down somewhere and available to the opponents. Obviously in parliamentary that would come across more verbally, so you would actually read it off your page instead of just kind of making it up off your head as they ask you a question about it, but you would actually look at your page and say, here's what we have written down. And that would remain the same throughout the debate. Because changing it throughout the debate makes you what? Does anybody know the phrase for that?
Shady.
Well, it does make you shady, but in debate speak, it makes you, I heard somebody say it, I don't know who said it.
Yeah.
It makes you a moving target. Okay? And that's not fair because it's really hard to beat a moving target. Because you just get to dodge all of our arguments by changing your advocacy. Okay? So plan text you should have always written down. That is also true of the affirmative, I think. But the bottom line really is don't be shady. Once you advocate something, you should be stuck with it for the rest of the debate. So don't put your name on the shady label. That's my advocacy. Thoughts on writing good text and things that you should think about. The first thing that you should think about is the potential solvency deficit arguments. Who can tell me what a solvency deficit argument is? Did you say something?
Huh?
Did you say something?
Yeah, you're just not, you don't solve partially, it's not really like significant.
Yeah, exactly. You might solve some of what the affirmative solves for, but you don't solve for everything the affirmative solves for. So you need to think about those things, and you need to think strategically about those things, because a lot of times the counterplan can't solve for everything the affirmative solves for. But what do you get to weigh out against those solvency deficits if you're strategic and smart?
Their disadvantages.
Yeah, your disadvantages. So you've got to think about it. When writing your text, you've got to think, okay, how big is the thing that I don't solve for? And how do I explain my disadvantage to the affirmative so that it's bigger than that thing is? Okay, think about those things ahead of time. Don't wait until you're in the actual debate, because you want to be in a position where you can explain that really well at the end of the debate. You can think of add-on advantages that the affirmative might run that they would be able to solve for and you would not be able to solve for. And again, you want to position those things against the disadvantages. So you've got to think strategically before the round even happens. You've got to think a lot. And then the last thing is how your counterplan interacts with other arguments you're running. And this becomes particularly obvious that people haven't done this when a smart affirmative calls them out after the 1NC or during their first opposition speech. So, they kind of stand up and they're like, well, don't you link to that same argument? And you see the look on the, government or affirmative's face and they're like, oh crap, yeah, I do link to that argument, don't I? Think about those things. It depends on your judge. I am not a judge who thinks it's a performative contradiction for you to argue a counterplan that also links to one of your negative arguments in the debate. I think that's fine. You have to make a decision at the end of the round, but I think that's fine. But you will have judges who think that that is an illegitimate positioning of arguments in the round, that you have arguments that, do the same thing that the affirmative does that's bad, and so you're responsible for those arguments. And they might vote against you just based on that bad strategy. So make sure you know your judges, make sure you're aware of anything that your counterplan links to, like case turns or disadvantages or critiques that you're running in the debate. And even if you have a judge like me who says, that's fine to have that in the first negative speech, by the time you get to the end of the debate, you have to have a strategy of how to be consistent in that last negative speech. So how do you get out of some of those other arguments and decide what you're going to advocate? Make sense to everyone? So there's a lot of thought that has to go into getting ready for a counterplan debate. A lot of people just kind of pull out their counterplan text that somebody else on their team wrote and read it, and they don't think through these things. And typically that means they have a really bad strategic vision of the round because they haven't thought through a lot of things. And so if you're debating a smart affirmative, they're going to beat you every time. So you've got to think ahead, you've got to know the answers, and you've got to know some of the things that the affirmative is going to call you out for and be able to respond to those arguments like you've thought about them. Okay? All right, so those are my thoughts. Any questions about writing good text other than that? And if you think about these things, you will automatically kind of write text and then revise them and then revise them again, because you'll start to think about, oh wait, if I write it that way, then there's this huge solvency deficit that my disadder isn't really bigger than. But if I write it this other way, then I capture more of that solvency. So you'll start to think things through a lot more specifically about the way that you write your counterplan texts. All right, second thing we talked about. So that was number one. Number two, typically in the order that people present them, is this notion of resolutionality or topicality discussion. And so I put this up because I think this is a really representative of what often happens in debates. So this is a judging panel, and you ask the question beforehand, or you read their judging philosophies, and you say, what are your opinions on topical counterplans? And you have one person who's like, yeah, they're fine. You have another person who's like, no way. And then you have the third judge who's probably just been pulled out of some, other judging at the tournament, and they're like, I don't even know what a counterplan is. So you have to be able to adapt your arguments to your judges. That is the most important thing that you can do. And that's really true of pretty much everything you do on counterplan debates, is you need to know your judges and you need to get to know them. So if you have debated in front of someone and you know the way they judge counterplans, then you don't need to ask questions. Obviously, you should just debate in the way that they asked you to debate last time, or in the way that their decision indicated you should debate in front of them. But sometimes if you see a new judge, you want to ask them some questions, or you want to read their judging philosophy and figure out what it is. Okay? So resolutionality and topicality, you can approach it in a couple of different ways. Again, in Parley, it probably depends a lot on your judge and the topic that you're debating. In LD, there's been a rule change in the last few years where previously you couldn't have topical counterplans, and now they're allowing topical counterplans. But you still have a lot of judges who are going to prefer non-topical counterplans. So you have to have some choices in your strategies. And I think that's true across the board. You should have some choice in strategy that includes non-topical counterplans, and you should have some choice in strategies that you include topical counterplans as part of those choices. If you're arguing a non-topical counterplan, the thing that you do in this part of the 1NC shell, this topicality statement or resolutionality statement, is you explain how you're non-topical. And it shouldn't just be, we're obviously non-topical, okay? Because it may not be obvious to your opponent, and it may not be obvious to the judge in the back of the room, and you want to make sure everybody's on the same page. So your explanation should include things like any words in the resolution that you violate. So maybe you're not the United States federal government. Maybe you're doing development somewhere other than the moon, okay? And then in Parley, you have to look at the topic and obviously figure out which words you violate. But you want to give that explanation to your opponent and to your judge. If you're arguing topical counterplans, even if you have a judge that you know accepts topical counterplans, I think it's good to have an explanation of why topical counterplans are good, because your opponent may debate you on that point. So why not preempt that argument and go ahead and put a reason? It takes probably 5 seconds to read this statement in the debate, and you've already got an argument in the debate about why topical counterplans should be okay. Okay, and is there any questions in here about competition standards and how they relate to topical counterplans being okay? There's a theory in debate called parametrics. Is anyone familiar with that theory? All right, parametrics was a theory that came about when there was this discussion of whether the negative should be able to advocate things that fall within the resolution. And so what parametrics says, once the affirmative chooses their advocacy example of the resolution, that becomes the focus of debate. And the negative gets to advocate anything outside of that, even if it's topical. So it used to be, here's the umbrella of topical plans, and here's the umbrella of non-topical plans, and the affirmative gets under this umbrella, and the negative gets under this umbrella, and everybody knows before the debate happens which umbrella you belong under. But parametric says, well, the affirmative, by getting to advocate this case that we don't know about ahead of time, gets some strategic positioning in the round, right? Like, you don't get to know what the affirmative is advocating. They get all this prep time getting ready for it. So they have some strategic advantage. So we're going to narrow the umbrella that they get down to actually what they're advocating. And we're going to make this negative umbrella a lot bigger to be anything except for what the affirmative. So you can't just stand up and say, well, we're going to argue what they're saying. And that's okay, because you can be topical. That would not be acceptable, because parametric says that is affirmative ground now, whatever the affirmative advocates. And you don't get that ground. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to plan-inclusive counterplans, because parametrics is really the theory that undergirds all the plan-inclusive counterplan bad debate. Okay? For those of you who know what PICs are, we'll explain that later. So, topical counterplans are legitimate, we usually say, because competition checks abuse. As long as we can prove that the negative counterplan competes against the affirmative advocacy under the theory of parametrics, then we prove that it's fair. Okay? Because we get that bigger umbrella now. All right, any questions about that? Okay. All right, oh, what? Don't do that. All right. Where did I save my, I have more of this lecture, I promise. All right, I'm gonna turn this off. I'm actually gonna go. I know what the next thing is, and I'm gonna pull out my laptop and plug it in. I know it's on my laptop. So the next thing we're gonna talk about is this theory of competition. So what I want you to do right now in your notes is I want you to write down what you think statements of competition include. What are some statements of competition? How do you argue competition in a debate round? What are some of the different ways? Oh, so used to touch screens. What happened is I did not save my latest version in Dropbox, so I'll do that right now. Okay, everybody got their ideas for competition? Do you need a little bit longer? Okay, pair up and share. See how they compare.
No, that's like a specific.
Competition?
No, they're just trying to. No, you're getting into specific arguments. Sorry.
You can run anywhere.
Like in those LDs, like it's like its own observation. You can put an LD into a non-competition case, but a non-competition change is still permanent. There's no point in it can happen at the same time. It's just that counterplan is not legitimate unless it's because they say like focus part of the solution, then it's unfair because you're taking affirmative ground. You go out before then people still hold on to free paramedics.
Oh, is it?
You can say yes or no, you belong here.
Personality, so
That's perfect. That's funny. When I saw that, I was like, that's perfect.
Well, I think she's just looking for like general types of.
Okay, so what do we have? What are some of the answers that we have?
Competition.
I erased it, so we got these three things in a counterplan. Everybody's got those. Great.
Like, how does the plan, like, how do the counterplan?
All right. What do we have for competition? Yes.
Mutual exclusivity.
Okay, mutual exclusivity. And who can explain to me what that is? Or that person who just gave me the answer. What is your name?
Ben.
Ben.
Proves that it can't be termed and it can't be adopted by the affirmation.
Okay, so it cannot be permed, cannot be adopted by the
Affirmation.
AF, okay? So mutual exclusivity, a lot of people would just say they can't both be done at the same time, right? Okay, what's the other argument? That is probably puts the negative on a little bit better grounding because sometimes it's hard to find totally mutually exclusive negative counterplans. So what's the other argument that we make? Anyone?
Net benefits.
Yes, net benefits. And what do you mean by that, Kyle?
you're gonna be weighing the good and the bad of doing either plan, and you just kind of see which one on the whole will leave the world better off or less bad. So just weighing advantages and disadvantages.
Okay, so net benefits says that, but in order to prove that the negative competes, what do you have to prove? So you are weighing disadvantages and advantages of, doing the affirmative and doing the negative, but what do you really have to prove in order to
That
win
does solve
a
the-
net benefits debate?
Counterplan does solve for the harms.
Not necessarily, because remember we talked earlier that if you have that solvency deficit argument, it's okay. You might have some solvency deficits,
It's
but you have something to weigh out over it. What?
impact analysis.
Impact analysis of doing the plan alone, right? Because that's what the affirmative advocates to start. And then what else does the affirmative get to advocate as well? Or not advocate, but what else does the affirmative get to test? So you've got the affirmative plan and solvency and advantages on one side, and you've got the counter plan, solvency and advantages on the other side. So the easiest discussion would obviously be, well, you weigh the AF plan, solvency and advantages against the counter plan, solvency and advantages. But the net benefits discussion brings a whole new thing in because we don't have this mutual exclusivity. What does it bring in?
You have to also beat the term if it's.
Yeah, you also have to beat the permutation. So the affirmative gets both those arguments. Okay? Now, we'll talk a little bit about the theory of permutations, but it's important to realize that net benefits moves us into a little bit more complex discussion than just, is the AF plan better than the counter plan? Does that make sense to everybody? Okay, so that's net benefits. All right. I think this should have updated now. Let me see. Sorry about that. I was offline this morning when I saved this, so it did not save my most updated version. Yeah, but if I was giving a lecture on technology and debate, I would say don't ever do this during a debate tournament if you're debating on the computer. All right, there they are. Okay. Let's find the current slide, so we're on. Okay, so let's look at an example. Oh, just hold that back up for you. Let's look at this example. The plan is to go to class. Let's say you have class around noon, all right? And the plan originally, obviously, is to go to class. The counter plan is you're really hungry, so the counter plan is to go to lunch. Within the realm of net benefits, what might that look like? So you've got the original plan with solvency and advantages. What are some things that might be good about going to lunch? Going to class.
Education.
Okay, you increase ed.
Won't get in trouble.
Okay, so no, penalties, let's say. So maybe you lose points for being absent from class, or you miss a quiz, or whatever. So there's no penalties, decrease in penalties. Anything else about going to class that'd be good? All right, we'll leave it at those two advantages. Okay, so go to lunch is the counter plan. What are the advantages of going to lunch?
Sustenance.
Okay, so you feed yourself.
Nutrition.
So you decrease hunger. Increase nutrition. So depending on what else is happening later that day, that might be important. Okay, maybe you have some athletic event that you have to go and compete in, and you need some nutrition in order to do that effectively. What else?
Increase the probability of networking.
Okay, wow, all right. So maybe you're going to run into, there's no guarantee of that,
Yeah.
but maybe increased networking. You know who you're going to see in class, but you never know who you're going to see when you're out to lunch. All right, so we've got an affirmative case with some advantages, and we've got a negative counterplan with some advantages. Are these two mutually exclusive?
Oh, yeah.
Really?
It depends.
It depends. Thank you. Yeah, it depends, right? How could you not make these mutually exclusive? Okay, you could do, you can't really do necessarily one and then the other, because the way that the negative has said this is that it's going to happen at the same time. So you've got a time constraint there. But you could position yourself so you could do both for at least, what?
Some part of time.
Yeah, exactly. You might go to class. So let's say you have a quiz, right? Penalties discussion might be a quiz right at the beginning of class. So maybe you can go to the beginning, and then that takes out that negative, right? Because you've taken the quiz now. You can leave and go to lunch anyways, all right? So the permutation discussion brings in this idea of, well, let's see all the ways that we might be able to do these together. And then the affirmative gets to say, if we can do these together and there's good things that result, I get to weigh those benefits. As long as I can do the affirmative. Okay? Now, it is an important discussion, and this is super important when you're looking at permutations and looking at whether permutations function or not, that it has to be a combination of the plan, all of the plan, and all or part of the counterplan. So what did I just do with that permutation? What?
Severance.
Yeah, I just did a severance permutation. Okay, so there's a couple of different types of permutations that you need to be aware of, because permutations just test the competitiveness of the plan and the counterplan, okay? Most judges will not say that you are actually advocating a permutation when you just position one in the debate. You have to actually come out as the negative and say you're doing that, for most judges. I'm not saying all judges, but for most judges. Most judges assume that you're just arguing it as a test. It's really kind of like a no-link argument on a counterplan. It just says, hey, there's no competitive link between these two arguments. And again, theoretically, they need to combine all of the 1AC text, which was to attend class. So when you take out part of that 1AC text, it's like the affirmative is kind of becoming, what was that phrase that I wrote down here earlier? Does anybody remember the two words? When people change their advocacy around? Moving target. Yeah, the affirmative is now becoming a moving target because they're like, oh, I didn't even go to class the whole time. You misunderstood me. So you've got to ask some points of clarification about what they're actually positioning themselves as. Okay? Don't be the shady tree. That's what happens when you start saying, I didn't mean go to class the whole time. Let me reposition myself now that I know you're going to say we should go to lunch. I didn't know you were going to do that. I don't want to advocate what I originally advocated. Okay? So there's two types of illegitimate permutations. Most judges would say they were illegitimate anyway, so you should still make arguments about why they're illegitimate. The first we just demonstrated, the severance permutation. And that's where the affirmative says, oh, that thing that I said I was advocating in the first speech, I'm not totally advocating that whole thing anymore. I'm just going to advocate part of it. Okay? Affirmatives don't get to do that. Once you say your affirmative plan text, you're stuck with it. The whole round. The whole thing. Okay? The other type is called an intrinsicness permutation. How many of you have heard that term? Intrinsicness? Okay. Intrinsicness permutation is where you add something that wasn't previously there and then try to say that you're testing competition. So the severance takes something away that you previously advocated. The intrinsicness permutation adds something that wasn't in the original plan text and not in the original counterplan text. So it adds something totally new that was not advocated by either side. Okay? And both of these, you can make these two arguments against them. Destroys negative ground, because obviously if you just get to make new arguments out of the blue or do away with old arguments out of the blue, then as a negative, I'm pretty screwed in that debate. Because I've lost all my link ground. Okay, you just kind of get to move yourself around and my links go away as you move yourself around. And then the other is again, makes what I see a moving target. So you don't have any argumentative responsibility anymore. Okay? And there's other, there's time frame permutations. I think these two are pretty universally accepted as being illegitimate. Time frame permutations, it depends on the way that they're argued and the way they're positioned in the round, because it does mean that you don't have to do both of them at the same time, is why those arguments are a little bit more questionable and need a little bit more explanation to win. But you can definitely win arguments about why time frame permutations are illegitimate. So some people will say, like, do the plan and then do the counterplan, or do the plan and do the counterplan and then do the plan. I think doing the plan and then doing the counterplan is probably a little bit more legitimate, because you've done your affirmative first and then whatever links happen. And if you can prove that it's a possibility that the counterplan would just happen after that, I think that that's a little bit more theoretically unobjectionable than doing the counterplan first and then doing the plan. And that happens to be because of an immediacy assumption of the affirmative plan. When does the plan get passed? Typically, just if you're theoretically thinking about debate, when does the plan get passed if the judge votes affirmative? Immediately upon them signing the ballot. Right? That's the first thing that happens is plan passes. So if you get to stand up and say, well, plan, we're going to delay that for a little while, and we'll do the counter plan first, that seems a little bit more questionably theoretic to me. Okay? All right, any questions about that? All right, so net benefits, we've talked about the fact that you need to weigh the combination of the permutations. So the net benefits really need to focus on what is garnered by the counterplan alone. So when Kyle, answered and you said, well, you have to look at what the advantages are and what the disadvantages are and kind of weigh those out together, that's true. But if the permutation captures any of those disadvantages, then you don't really get to weigh those anymore. Does that make sense? So you've got to be careful in the way that you're arguing your solvency terms, your disadvantages, your critiques. You've got to be really specific about the links on those and the way that they function in the round with the plan and the counterplan. And hopefully if you've done that job of thinking about your counterplan text strategically that we talked about first, you know all those answers. And so the net benefits argument is pretty easy to make. Okay? And you've got to be able to explain how the permutation doesn't solve for those. Because the affirmative gets to test that argument, right? They get to say, hey, the permutation solves. And they don't have to do a lot of explanation. They get to say, perm, it solves. And they'll say, make something up. You have to be able to defend why that's not true. You don't get to say, permutation doesn't solve, and leave it at that. You've got to have a really good explanation of why that's not true. Okay? And that's why it's really important to think about those that counterplan text beforehand and how it works with the other arguments in the round. All right, how about types of counterplans now? In your notes, write down types of counterplans that you know about. And don't write down things like states. So last year, if you debated the LD topic, you may have run a states argument. But that's an example of an agent, alternative agent counterplan. So think big categories of types of counterplans. Do I just go over since I started late, do you know? Or should I try to end on
I
that?
think a little bit over. I think there's like a 15-minute period.
Yeah. Okay. All right, pair up and share. What do you have? I was like, I got nothing. Everybody should have alternative agent, right? I gave that one to you.
That's fair.
You couldn't run that?
If the plan is out and you say you plan 6 months,
I can't remember being there that time frame. To do their plan now and do it later.
No, you just part of the program plan, the part that says everything but the
Is what?
Not necessarily.
It's actually not at all the same.
We'll do it.
The funding may change due to the agent. But that's not, because you can change funding without.
I'm taking part of your counterplan.
It falls into one of the categories that I'll put in there, but it's not a category.
Like, what would you do doing it right now?
I mean, yeah, the firm will still buy the heads.
Well, yeah, you can
Okay, what are some of your answers? Let's hear them. What are some of the types of counterplans
like 2 to 3 years ago. Like, there's like
that you all came up with? It looks like tires. Okay. Picks, which if you it's hard to write on the board. Okay. Everybody should have an alternative agent. I gave it to you, right?
Alternative funding.
Okay. There's a bigger category for that. Funding is something that you can do differently, but there's a bigger category. Zach?
No, I didn't raise my hand.
You had funding though. Yeah.
Consult counterparts?
Yeah, although I would not put those in a, I'm gonna put those down at the bottom in parentheses. They don't get their own category, but we'll talk about them. And funding I'll put down there too.
Study counterplan.
Okay, and study. These are all a type, these all fall into a bigger category of counterplan.
Conditional.
Anyone? No, that's a theory, that's not counterplan type. All right, so well, let's look at them. So we've got traditional alternative solutions. Those are just where you kind of say mutually exclusive, you do this thing, we do this thing. We also have agent, we talked about that. What you all are discussing is more this process counterplan. So it's not what you do, but it's the way you do it. So that includes things like funding and consulting and all of those things. Those are called process counterplans. You change the process by which the affirmative does their plan. And you hopefully capture some benefit from that. How about exclusionary counterplans? Does anybody know what that is? And I don't know how popular these are, but I include them because it seems like whatever was happening in team policy debate comes through the pipe to both Carly and LD at some point, and these were popular, still are.
Just do part of the plan, leave a part out, that's probably right.
Yeah, you instead of doing plan inclusive counterplans, you do part of the plan, but you exclude something from it. So you do all of the plan except for this thing that causes this disadvantage to occur.
So the severance would be an example of that.
But you get to do that. It's not severance permutation, it's severance counterplan. But yeah, you can call this a severance counterplan, sure. Exclusionary severance, sure. You sever out a part of the plan. But that's legit because you're on the negative. Okay? And then there's utopian counterplans. Often people will run these with critiques. They're often mindset-oriented counterplans, like everybody in the world will start meditating and we'll get world peace, right? That's not going to happen. You're not going to read any solvency for that, really. So those are considered utopian counterplans. If you let people get away with it, they'll get away with it. All right? They'll advocate it and they'll be able to argue about it. So it's important to know what type of counterplan you're advocating, but it's really important to know what kind of counterplan you're debating when you're on the affirmative because it changes the way that you answer that counterplan. Okay, so what is an agent counterplan?
Like the 50 states.
Okay,
Everyone.
and what do they do? What is the counterplan an agent?
So if the same exact plan, just don't have the federal government do it, give it to the 50 states to have them kind of
Yeah,
do
the
agent.
action of the plan basically remains the same as just who's doing that plan. Okay, so the action remains the same, but it's who's doing it. The process counterplan is kind of the opposite of that. It could still be the same agent that's doing it, but you totally change the way they're doing it, or you totally change something about the way they're doing it. So you could totally change their funding mechanism if they offer one, which is why it's dangerous to offer one, a clear funding mechanism in your 1AC, because it makes counterplanning, process counterplanning, a whole lot easier if you can find a better way to fund it and then run a disad to whatever they're trading off with, right? So it's better to stay a little bit vague in that respect in the 1AC.
So if they are vague in that because they're smart about it, can you like POI and be like, well, what is your actual funding, and then are they forced to?
They can be forced to, or they could say normal means. and then it's your job to prove that those normal means that they would trade off with something else. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So I think smart debaters will even not answer specifically when you say that, but they'll say through normal means, if you can prove we trade off with something, we'll debate that. But otherwise it could be, so for example, if somebody says normal means, I think they link to a spending disad, period. Normal means of the government when they institute a new policy is to pay for it typically, or they link to unfunded mandates. So those are two arguments that you're guaranteed to link to. If you run your spending disad and they say, hey, we don't link to that, then you can say, well, then you're an unfunded mandate, and here's all the reasons why those are bad. Because you either guarantee funding or you don't. Does that make sense? But you should not offer that information in the first speech typically, because you're giving the negative a bit more ground than, I think, strategically. There's no benefit to it, usually. And why isn't it good? So a lot of people think, but why wouldn't I trade off with this bad program, right? This used to be really popular when I debated. So they'd say, like, we're going to do our policy, and we're going to take the money from the program that's going to fund these new planes that are horrible, right? What is that called when an affirmative does that?
Alternative funding kind of.
No, when the affirmative does it. So the affirmative stands up and they say, hey, we're going to do our plan. It's going to cost, we're going to go to the moon. It's going to cost a lot of money, but we're going to trade off with this plane, this money that we have invested in these planes, and that's really good because those planes don't work right. So we get an advantage from that too. What is that plank of the plan now? As far as the affirmative is concerned. Do they get to do that? Do they get to claim advantages off their funding plank?
Yeah.
The answer is no. Yes, go to the topicality lecture. They are extra topical. You do not get to claim advantages off of non-topical portions of the plan. The resolution doesn't say anything about trading off with some planes, right? It doesn't say anything about where you get your funding from. You just get to advocate what is within the resolution. So don't let affirmatives get away with that kind of stuff. And when they do that kind of, because a lot of times they do that kind of stuff to capture some of your negative counterplan ground, right? They're like, oh, you're gonna run that counterplan, or you're gonna run that disad on the plane thing, right? I'm gonna capture that now. Well, they shouldn't get to do that because that's extra topical, okay? And for that reason, I think they have a legitimate reason why they don't have to explain funding either. They can just say normal means, but then they have to link to those arguments. They don't get to get out of those.
But then they do get to access it in a context of a turn and then claim it in that benefits.
If they can prove that normal means would take money from that plane budget, which you might be able to find evidence for that.
How do you do that? That's my question. Like, how do you prove that you're taking it?
You find evidence that says this is what the government would do if they passed this plan. So a lot of times, like for this moon topic right now that we're debating in LD, there's a lot of evidence out there that says if NASA decides to go to the moon as their focus, they're going to have to do away with their asteroids program in order to focus on the moon. That's a trade-off argument that I think the affirmative can make and claim advantage off of.
So,
if the negative makes that argument, they don't get to do it in the money seat.
So then, as the negative, like, can you not make a moving target argument against that? If you're like, well, hey, they don't tell us their funding, so in our counterplan, we can't say we have different funding than them, because then they can claim, well, that was our funding the whole time.
Right. I think it's the normal means argument means that, for me anyways, normal means is lit checked. So if the negative can read an argument why you trade off with something good, you should be able to read an argument why you trade off with something bad, but it's got to be supported in the literature. I know that's harder in Parley,
that's what
and Parley is hard because a lot of people will just make up that stuff, right? They'll be like, no, we get to trade off with this program, totally. So I think you need to force them on, can you give me some examples where that's happened in the past? Or can you give me any indication that anyone is talking about that right now, that happening right now, right? Like it's current events, so you should be able to talk within the literature even though you're not reading literature. So, and as a judge in the back of the room, I would be like, yeah, you should be able to kind of explain that. You don't just get to say that in Parley, okay?
So just really quickly, for the affirmative, to preempt like what we just talked about with asteroids, then it would be beneficial to assign a funding source that's not normal means, right?
Well, if there's something good about the asteroids, then yes, it would be good to say, no, that's not true. And you might just have to come up with good reasons why the spending disad is okay. Right, there's no impact, which is good arguments why there's really not that much impact. Like the government increases their spending all the time. We have debt, we had debt ceiling debates for the last 5 years and we haven't gone to a nuclear war yet. So seems like we're empirically okay on that respect. So I think you have to debate the bottom of the dissad, the internal links and the impact debate, rather than the top of that debate, if that makes sense.
Right.
And just say, yeah, we'll say we spend money. That's fine. You know, we're going to keep the asteroid program. We'll say we spend extra money. We'll debate your spending dissad. Okay? All right, I'm going to end it here. I will post this. I will give this. There's theory arguments on the end here that you should be familiar with. And if you need, I'll write my email up here. If you would like copies of some generic theory blocks with explanations of each of those theory arguments, so you can kind of come to a better understanding of how those function on the affirmative and how those function on the negative, I can send those to you. Just send me an email and I'll send those to you. But I was going to talk about theory and I was going to talk about affirmative answers, and those were the only two things that are left. And I'll post this PowerPoint and you can email me for further explanation, or I have like briefs that I can send to you that are just analyticals written out with explanations. Okay? All right. That's all I got.